Today is March 11, 2017, and it is the beginning of the 13th day of the 12th Hebrew month, which is the celebration of the victory over Nicanor. And so we're going to be discussing that this evening. But before we begin, let's ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. We are so glad to be able to come to you and search for knowledge of the truth. We appreciate you guiding us as you have so far. Please guide us now in our discussion. Help us to have a clear understanding of the principles involved. Help us to conduct a genuine experiment now and to be able to come out the other side of this meeting having learned something valuable. Thank you so much. We expect much and therefore attempt much. Thank you so much. Guide us. We ask this b'shem tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so this is, again, as I mentioned, the celebration of the victory of the defeat of Nicanor, and this is described in the books 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And I think that to start, it will be good to read these passages so that we're refreshed as to what this is referring to. But beyond that, I think that it will be good to us, or it will be good for us, to discuss essentially the validity of the feast or of this memorial and its relevance, and kind of I think it's good for us to question, well, are these feasts things that we should keep or not? Both this celebration and also Purim, described in the book of Esther. These things are debated among people who are interested in keeping the quote-unquote laws of quote-unquote the Old Testament. The reason why is because these sorts of feasts, and Hanukkah is actually included, are not commanded in Leviticus 23 or in Numbers 28. And since most people consider Leviticus and Numbers to have been written by Moses and thus part of the law of Moses, and since it says that these are the feasts of the Lord or the feasts of Yahweh, they are definitely considered by many people to be more authoritatively grounded. Whereas Purim, the celebration of the defeat of Nicanor, and Hanukkah are considered to be, less relevant or optional or not to be kept, different things like that. But that's debated, and it depends on who you talk to. Some people look at the example of Jesus keeping Hanukkah and say, okay, well, there you go. And others would say, well, we're supposed to keep Purim because that's in the Bible, whereas Hanukkah and the celebration of the defeat of Nicanor are not. So not to get into all of that quite yet, but I wanted to mention kind of the direction that we should go in terms of asking the question, well, since these feasts do not make the claim, or I'll say since the people involved in first introducing these feasts do not make the claim that they are ancient feasts that Yahweh ordained or anything like that, but are rather commemorations of significant events in history, we want to consider how we should view these days, both in terms of simply our consideration of them and also our observance of them. So we'll get into that, but I think it'll be good first to read these passages concerning the defeat of Nicanor and the annual celebration of that. And we may kind of start with focusing on that, and we may end up getting into Purim, even though according to most of the verses that we have, Purim is the 14th and 15th of the month, and this is going into the 13th, starting this evening. There are passages within Esther that refer to the 13th as being a day of deliverance, and so that's something that we should look at as well. So the whole Nicanor thing is, the passages are pretty short, and it may not take a whole lot of time to discuss, so we'll see if we end up getting into Purim discussion or not. So anyway, the first passage that is dealing with the defeat of Nicanor is in 1 Maccabees chapter 7. And of course, the story starts earlier, but I think that it would be good for us to read from verse 26 to verse 50, which is the end of the chapter, because that kind of describes the events surrounding Nicanor and what he did and how his end came. So would anyone like to volunteer to read that passage? Again, 1 Maccabees chapter 7, verses 26 to 50.
I'm happy to read it.
Wonderful.
Then the king sent Nicanor, one of his honored princes, who hated and detested Israel, and he commanded him to destroy the people. So Nicanor came to Jerusalem with a large force, and treacherously sent to Judas and his brothers this peaceable message: Let there be no fighting between you and me. I shall come with a few men to see you face to face in peace. So he came to Judas, and they greeted one another peaceably. But the enemy were preparing to kidnap Judas. It became known to Judas that Nicanor had come to him with treacherous intent, and he was afraid of him and would not meet him again. When Nicanor learned that his plan had been disclosed, he went out to meet Judas in battle near Kafar Salama. About 500 of the army of Nicanor fell, and the rest fled into the city of David. After these events, Nicanor went up to Mount Zion. Some of the priests from the sanctuary and some of the elders of the people came out to greet him peaceably and to show him the burnt offering that was being offered for the king. But he mocked them and derided them and defiled them and spoke arrogantly. And in anger he swore this oath: Unless Judas and his army are delivered into my hands this time, then if I return safely, I will burn up this house. And he went out in great anger. At this, the priests went in and stood before the altar and the temple. They wept and said, You chose this house to be called by your name and to be for your people a house of prayer and supplication. Take vengeance on this man and on his army, and let them fall by the sword. Remember their blasphemies, and let them live no longer. Now Nicanor went out from Jerusalem and encamped in Beth-horon, and the Syrian army joined him. Judas encamped in Adasa with 3,000 men. Then Judas prayed and said, When the messengers from the king spoke blasphemy, your angel went out and struck down 185,000 of the Assyrians. So also crush this army before us today. Let the rest learn that Nicanor has spoken wickedly against the sanctuary, and judge him according to this wickedness. So the armies met in battle on the 13th day of the month of Adar. The army of Nicanor was crushed, and he himself was the first to fall in the battle. When his army saw that Nicanor had fallen, they threw down their arms and fled. The Jews pursued them a day's journey from Adasa as far as Gazara, and as they followed, they kept sounding the battle call on the trumpets. People came out of all the surrounding villages of Judea, and they outflanked the enemy and drove them back to their pursuers, so that they all fell by the sword. Not even one of them was left. Then the Jews seized the spoils and the plunder. They cut off Nicanor's head and the right hand that he had so arrogantly stretched out, and brought them and displayed them just outside Jerusalem. The people rejoiced greatly and celebrated that day as a day of great gladness. They decreed that this day should be celebrated each year on the 13th day of Adar. So the land of Judah had rest for a few days.
Okay, so that describes the events surrounding this individual Nicanor, his threatenings against the temple, that is, to burn it, and how he came and attacked Judas Maccabeus and the Jews, and how they had victory, the Jews had victory over Nicanor and his forces. And, of course, he was killed in battle, the first to die, on the 13th day of the 12th Hebrew month. And according to this record, they cut off his head and his right hand, displayed it just outside Jerusalem, and it was a great day of victory. This took place, according to First Maccabees, from what I'm able to discern by the prior context of the previous chapter, even the beginning of chapter 7, it says, in the 151st year, Demetrius, son of Seleucus, set out from Rome, etc. The footnote in the New Revised Standard Version of the Apocrypha at that point says 161 BC, and there's no new date introduced from then till what we just read. And so this is just 4 years after Hanukkah, the dedication of the temple. So this is a really, we know the time. We've been studying the time for a while, getting familiar with the Maccabees and so on. And just soon after the temple was restored, it was threatened, and this is how the temple was preserved. So that's the first record that we have. The second record that we have is in 2nd Maccabees. And what I'm thinking to do is we could just read that so that we have both before us, both in mind, and then we can begin to discuss them. So, let us see. In 2nd Maccabees, it's in chapter 15 is where it is discussed, or where the defeat of Nicanor is discussed. However, in chapter 14, the subject is somewhat introduced. Nicanor is mentioned. It discusses how he at least sought to make friends with Judas, and how he turned against him. And then it continues on into chapter 15. So I'm thinking maybe in order to kind of get the understanding as presented in 2nd Maccabees, it might be good to just read through from chapter 14. And let's see where a good starting place would be. The first reference that I'm seeing is in verse 12, but it looks like we'll have to start a little bit before then. Maybe we'll just read from the beginning of the chapter. From the beginning of chapter 14. Would anyone like to start reading at the beginning of chapter 14, and maybe you'll just read that chapter, and then we will go from there, and someone else might read chapter 15, unless someone wants to read the whole thing, that is.
I'll read chapter 14.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Okay. 3 years later, Judas and his companions learned that Demetrius, son of, you have helped me with pronunciation, Seleucus, son of Seleucus, into the port of Tripolis with a powerful army and a fleet, and that he had occupied the country after doing away with Antiochus and his guardian Lysias. A certain alchemist, a former high priest, who had willfully incurred defilement before the time of the revolt, realized that there was no way for him to be safe and regain access to the holy altar. So he went to King Demetrius around the 151st year and presented him with a gold crown and a palm branch, as well as some of the customary olive branches from the temple. On that day, he kept quiet. But he found an opportunity to further his mad scheme when he was invited to the council by Demetrius and questioned about the dispositions and intentions of the Jews. He replied, "Those Jews called Essenes, led by Judas Maccabees, are warmongers who stir up sedition and keep the kingdom from enjoying peace. For this reason, now that I am deprived of my ancestral dignity, that is to say, the high priesthood, I have come here. First, out of my genuine concern for the king's interest, and second, out of consideration for my own compatriots, since our entire nation is suffering no little affliction from the rash conduct of the people just mentioned. When you have informed yourself in detail on these matters, O King, provide for our country and its hard-pressed people with the same gracious consideration that you show toward all. As long as Judas is around, it is impossible for the government to enjoy peace." When he had said this, the other friends who were hostile to Judas quickly added fuel to Demetrius' indignation. The king immediately chose Nicanor, who had been in command of the elephants, and appointed him governor of Judea. He sent him off with orders to put Judas to death, to disperse his followers, and to set up alchemists as high priests of the great temple. The Gentiles from Judea who had fled before Judas flocked to Nicanor, thinking that the misfortunes and calamities of the Jews would mean prosperity for themselves. When the Jews heard of Nicanor's coming and that the Gentiles were rallying to him, they sprinkled themselves with earth and prayed to him who established his people forever and who always comes to the aid of his heritage by manifesting himself. At their leader's command, they set out at once from there and came upon the enemy at the village of Edessa. Judas' brother Simon now engaged Nicanor, but he suffered a slight setback because of the sudden appearance of the enemy. However, when Nicanor heard of the valor of Judas and his companions and the great courage with which they fought for their country, he shrank from deciding the issue by bloodshed. So he sent Hothodonus, Theodus, and Matthias to exchange pledges of friendship. After a long discussion of terms, each leader communicated them to his troops. And when general agreement was expressed, they assented to the treaty. A day was set on which the leaders would meet by themselves. From each side, a chariot came forward, and thrones were set in place. Judas had posted armed men in readiness at strategic points for fear that the enemy might suddenly commit some treachery. But the conference was held in the proper way. Nicanor stayed in Jerusalem, where he did nothing out of place. He disbanded the throngs of the people who gathered around him, and he always kept Judas in his company, for he felt affection for the man. He urged him to marry and have children, so Judas married and settled into an ordinary life. Did somebody take over from there?
Sure, yeah, if you want to go on, or if anyone else wants to read, either way.
I'll surrender.
I don't mind reading, but my book's a little different. It's just
either way, it's so far we have 2 translations going here. So if you want to add a third one in, that's fine by me.
All right. But Alchemists, perceiving the love that was betwixt them, and considering the covenants that were made, came to Demetrius and told him that Nicanor was not well affected toward the state, for that he had ordained Judas, a traitor to his realm, to be the king's successor. Then the king, being in a rage and provoked with the accusations of the most wicked man, wrote to Nicanor, signifying that he was much displeased with the covenants, and commanding him that he should send Maccabees prisoner in all haste unto Antioch. When this came to Nicanor's hearing, he was much confounded in himself, and took it grievously that he should make void the articles which were agreed upon, the man being in no fault. But because there was no dealing against the king, he watched his time to accomplish this thing by policy. Notwithstanding, when Maccabees saw that Nicanor began to be churlish unto him, and that he entreated him more roughly than he was wont, perceiving that such sour behavior came not of good, he gathered together not a few of his men and withdrew himself from Nicanor. But the other, knowing that he was notably prevented by Judas's policy, came into the great and holy temple and commanded the priests that were offering their usual sacrifices to deliver him the man. And when they swear that they could not tell where the man was whom he sought, he stretched out his right hand toward the temple and made an oath in this manner: if you will not deliver me Judas as a prisoner, I will lay this temple of God even with the ground, and I will break down the altar and erect a notable temple unto Bacchus. After these words he departed. Then the priests lifted up their hands towards heaven and besought him that was ever a defender of their nation, saying in this manner: Thou, O Lord of all things, who hast need of nothing, was pleased that the temple of thine habitation should be among us. Therefore now, O holy Lord of all holiness, keep this house ever undefiled, which lately was cleansed, and stop every unrighteous mouth. now was there accused unto Nicanor one Razus, one of the elders of Jerusalem, a lover of his countrymen, and a man of very good report, who for his kindness was called a father of the Jews. For in the former times, when they were mingled not themselves with the Gentiles, he had been accused of Judaism, and did boldly jeopard his body and life with all vehemency for the religion of the Jews. So Nicanor, willing to declare the hate that he bare unto the Jews, sent above 500 men of war to take him, for he thought by taking him to do the Jews much hurt. Now when the multitude would have taken the tower, and violently broken into the outer door, and bade that fire should be brought to burn it, he, being ready to be taken on every side, fell upon his sword, choosing rather to die manfully than to come into the hands of the wicked, to be abused otherwise than beseemed his noble birth. But missing his stroke through haste, the multitude also rushing within the doors, he ran boldly up to the wall, and cast himself down manfully among the thickest of them. But they quickly giving back, and space being made, he fell down into the midst of the void place. Nevertheless, while there was yet breath within him, being inflamed with anger, he rose up, and though his blood gushed out like spouts of water, and his wounds were grievous, yet he ran through the midst of the throng, and standing upon a steep rock, when as his blood was now quite gone, he plucked out his bowels, and taking them in both of his hands, he cast them upon the throng, and calling upon the Lord of life and spirit to restore him to those again, he thus died.
Well, that is quite graphic. We do want to read the next chapter as well. Would anyone like to volunteer to do so?
Yeah, I'll do it. Okay, so this is 2 Maccabees chapter 15. But Nicanor, hearing that Judas and his company were in the strong places about Samaria, resolved without any danger to set upon them on the Sabbath day. Nevertheless, the Jews that were compelled to go with them said, O destroy not so cruelly and barbarously, but give honor to that day, which he that seeth all things hath honored with holiness above all other days. Then the most ungracious wretch demanded if there were a mighty one in heaven that had commanded the Sabbath day to be kept. And when they said, there is in heaven a living Lord and mighty who commanded the seventh day to be kept, then said the other, and I also am mighty upon earth, and I command to take arms and to do the king's business, yet he ordained not to have his wicked will done. So Nicanor, in exceeding pride and haughtiness, determined to set up a public monument of his victory over Judas and them that were with him. But Maccabees had ever sure confidence that the Lord would help him. Wherefore he exhorted his people not to fear the coming of the heathen against him, but to remember that the help which is former times they had received from heaven, and now to expect the victory and aid which should come unto them from the Almighty. And so comforting them out of the law of the prophets, and withal putting them in mind of the battles that they won afore, he made them more cheerful. And when he had stirred up their minds, he gave them their charge, showing them therewithal the falsehood of the heathen and the breach of oaths. Thus he armed every one of them, not so much with defensive shields and spears, as with comfortable and good words. And besides that, he told them a dream worthy to be believed, as if it had been so indeed, which did not a little rejoice them. And this was his vision, that Ananias, who had been high priest, a victorious and good man, reverend in conversation, gentle in condition, well-spoken also, and exercised from a child in all points of virtue, holding up his hands, prayed for the whole body of the Jews. This done, in like manner, there appeared a man with gray hairs, and exceeding glorious, who was a wonderful and excellent majesty. Then Ananias answered, saying, This is a lover of the brethren, who prayeth much for the people, and for the holy city, to wit, Jeremias the prophet of God. Whereupon Jeremias, holding forth his right hand, gave Judas a sword of gold, and in giving it spake thus, Take this holy sword, a gift from God, with which thou shalt wound the adversaries. Thus being well comforted by the words of Judas, which were very good, and able to stir them up to valor and to encourage the hearts of the young men, they determined not to pitch camp, but courageously to set upon them, and manfully to try to matter conflict, because the city and the sanctuary and the temple were in danger. For the care that they took for their wives and their children, their brethren and folks, was in least account with them, but the greatest and principal fear was for the holy temple. Also they that were in the city took not the least care, being troubled for the conflict abroad. And now, when all looked what would be the trial, and the enemies were already come near, and the army was set array, and the beasts conveniently placed, and the horsemen set in wings, Maccabees, seeing the coming of the multitude, and the diverse preparations of armor, and the fierceness of the beasts, stretched out his hands toward heaven, and called upon the Lord that worketh wonders, knowing that victory cometh not by arms, but even as it seemeth good to him, he giveth it to such as are worthy. Therefore in his prayer he said after this manner, O Lord, thou didst send thine angel in the time of Ezekias king of Judah, and didst slay the host of Sennacherib, 185,000. Wherefore now also, O Lord of heaven, send a good angel before us for a fear and dread unto them. And thou, the might of thine arm, let those be stricken with terror that come against the holy people to blaspheme. And he ended thus. Then Nicanor and they that were with him came forward with trumpet and songs. But Judas and his company encountered the enemies with invocation and prayer, so that fighting with their hands and praying unto God with their hearts, they slew no less than 55,000 men. For through the appearance of God they were greatly cheered. Now when the battle was done, returning again with joy, they knew that Nicanor lay dead in his harness. Then they made a great shout and a noise, praising the Almighty in their own language. And Judas, who was ever a chief defender of the citizens, both in body and mind, and who continued his love towards his countrymen all his life, commanded to strike off Nicanor's head and his hand with his shoulder and bring them to Jerusalem. So when he was there and called them of his nation together and set the priests before the altar, he sent for them that were of the tower and showed them vile Nicanor's head in the hand of the blasphemer, which with proud brags he had stretched out against the holy temple of the Almighty. And when he had cut out the tongue of that ungodly Nicanor, he commanded that they should give it by pieces unto the fowls, and hang up the reward of his madness before the temple. So every man praised toward the heaven the glorious God, saying, Blessed be he that hath kept his own place undefiled. He hanged also Nicanor's head upon the tower, an evident and manifest sign unto all of the help of the Lord. And they ordained all with a common decree, in no case to let that day pass without solemnity, but to celebrate the 13th day of the 12th month, which in the Syrian tongue is called Adar, the day before Maccabees Day. Thus went it with Nicanor, and from that time forth the Hebrews had the city in their power. And here will I make an end. And if I have done well, and as its fitting story, it is which I desired. But it slenderly and meanly, it is that which I could attain unto. For it is hurtful to drink wine or water alone, and as wine mingled with water is pleasant, that delighteth the taste. So, even so, speech finely framed delighteth the ears of them that readeth this story, and here shall be an end. We don't speak like that anymore.
Right. Is that from the King James Version?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I thought that it probably was. And it's so interesting hearing that language again, because I don't read the King James much anymore, and when I do, I kind of change the these and thous and kind of have it. I read it out loud more contemporary, but it's just so interesting hearing. I mean, it's understandable and everything, but like you said, yeah, we don't speak that way anymore, and some of it is more difficult to understand, but still coherent. But it has that poetic feel to it for sure. So those are the two most ancient accounts of which I'm aware of the defeat of Nicanor and the annual commemoration of that defeat. I'm pretty sure Josephus refers to it, but to my knowledge he's dependent upon these two accounts. So, I mean, there's lots of areas that we could discuss, but I just wanted to find out first, are there any comments or questions concerning what we read?
I have a comment. Much too graphic for my taste. There's a few things about this story that bothers me, or that doesn't quite seem to sit right, and that is the whole kind of celebrating of the death and dismemberment of Nicanor. And while I, recognize that, wars happen and people die and there's all these terrible things that do happen, and there's, no ignoring that these things take place, the idea of celebrating, kind of the negative aspect of it seems like the wrong focus for me. But
well, I want to ask, which aspect are you understanding as being a celebration of specifically his death and decapitation?
Well, I didn't say celebrating necessarily his decapitation, I don't think.
Well, I think you said dismemberment.
Mm-hmm. In First Maccabees, let me get there. Chapter
7.
7 and 4. First Maccabees. Displaying. I'm not finding it yet, but I'm remembering how they hung it up, the head and hand, and displayed it.
Yeah,
which I find pretty gruesome.
Verse 47 of First Maccabees, chapter 7, and also here in Second Maccabees. And
I know, of course, that was a different way of life. It really was. It was a completely different world back then, different way of doing things and all that. So I'm, trying to keep that in mind in relation to just how people would do things and displaying the heads of conquered peoples from various different nations was, from what I understand, a fairly common practice. And even just a few hundred years ago. I'm pretty sure the Catholic Church during the Crusades did that sort of thing. I'm trying to remember, unless it was just, entire people left up on the cross for however long at a time. But that sort of display, it raises questions in my mind as to whether that's right or wrong. And celebrating the protection of the temple, now I understand that. And I recognize that ultimately that's the point, is the kind of the saving of the temple. But, there's aspects of it that at least whoever wrote this historical account, very detailed, and maybe rightly so, I don't know.
Yeah, there's some things that I have to say in kind of in comment on your comment. And the reason why I asked the question as to which aspect, came across to you as celebrating, the death and dismemberment of Nicanor, is because in talking about celebrating it, what you said could be understood in at least a couple ways. Either the celebration of the event itself, that being the annual celebration on the 13th day, or it could be just the act of displaying his body parts and things like that could be viewed as celebrating his death and, specifically the gruesome aspects and so on and so forth. So I'm glad they asked, and because I don't think that the annual celebration is necessarily celebrating those details. I think it's celebrating the fact that, look, all of this could have happened again, where, basically the same thing that happened in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes could have happened right away again, and the whole temple service and the independence or relative independence of the Jewish people would have been greatly threatened. And, hey, it would have been horrible persecution of the Jews and all of that as well. So celebrating that, avoiding that whole scenario again is certainly worth celebrating and all of that. Mm-hmm. So that's one aspect. But then, of course, there are these other aspects of, oh, man, it just sounds so brutal, and it is very gruesome and graphic and disturbing. Although, in terms of just the authors writing 1st and 2nd Maccabees, if they're endeavoring to accurately report what happened, then of course mentioning it and describing it isn't necessarily bad. It somewhat reminds me of The Passion of the Christ, the movie by Mel Gibson, and Samuel Bakioki's criticism of it as being too graphic and so on, and then Doug's reply to Samuel Bakioki saying, look, the graphic aspect of it is not actually what is so bad. I mean, sure, it's an awful thing, but being really aware of how awful Christ's sufferings were and focusing on that can greatly impact a person in a positive way. And so sometimes, even though the events and the graphic nature of them themselves are awful in nature, focusing on it for a time is not actually necessarily a negative thing. But, of course, the real question which you're raising is whether that's valid, whether, like, even though, yeah, it's a different world and everything, is it actually, like, was it a good thing or not a good thing to display his head and all that sort of thing?
It doesn't seem necessary. You know what I mean? So.
I kind of disagree a little bit. I mean, I think you have this guy who was, setting out to destroy the temple, was able to gather this huge following, in pretty short order, and by them slaying Nicanor on the battlefield, his army left. They fled out of fear because of what the Jews were able to do. So if you're a Jew at that time, you're thinking, we want to make sure that these guys he was able to gather really quick don't stand against us again. We want them to remember this event, and how to put a memory in someone's head is to do something really graphic like that. And in the long run, it could have saved a lot of bloodshed, because there could have been future events that maybe were deterred because of them, kind of doing that public display.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think that's why certainly people would do things like that, is because it makes a sure statement. And if anyone among Nicanor's troops thought, okay, maybe let's try this again, even without Nicanor, and then they go and they see that display, what an awful thing. And then, of course, there's the aspect of no matter how gruesome it is, the fact is he was dead. It wasn't putting him through any more suffering.
That's true.
It was for the sake of the other people who would seek to try something like that again. So yeah, it's awful and graphic, and this is the sort of thing. Like I think it's a complex issue in a sense, because on one hand you have generally, is it okay to do an action like that? And then you have the question, under the circumstances, was it okay to do something like that? And when you say under those circumstances, you also have the issue of what was the world like then? And that's one of the things Teresa mentioned as well, like, hey, I understand that it was a different world back then in many ways. And that's true both temporally and geographically. And, of course, that ultimately has its impact on culture and everything. So, all those things do impact how severe of an act it would have been to the people. If you're in a world where something like that is not really practiced, and then something like that is done, and it's like totally unheard of, then it may seem like just nuts and like, oh, those people are totally barbarians, doing something like that. But if things have escalated to that point between nations where that sort of thing is commonplace, and even more severe things are commonplace, then it may be impossible to send the necessary message without doing something like that.
I'm also realizing that, wait a second, actually, you know what? That sort of thing still happens today.
Exactly.
Only it's not always, a head on a stake, but there for a while especially, you couldn't even look at a Facebook news thread without seeing dead bodies being displayed in pictures from Christians being killed, or at least that's what the caption said, various people being killed for their religious beliefs and by ISIS or whomever, and their dead bodies being displayed in various horrible ways. And even decapitated people, including children, are being displayed on the internet now. So for a minute I was thinking, oh yeah, the world's more civilized today, but it's not.
Yeah, it really isn't. And here's the thing. It's not like back then if Judas wanted to send the message that, hey, Nicanor is dead. It's not like he could take a picture on his iPhone and post it or send it to the Greeks and say, hey, look, he's dead. Don't try this again. Yeah,
that's true.
The only way to kind of do, like the closest equivalent to that would be to display the body.
Mm-hmm.
How else do you really do that in a way where people know, like, oh, he really is dead, and this is how things went down. And again, in saying this, in kind of like expressing a degree of understanding as to why they would do something like that, it's not to say that, oh, it's okay, it's okay just because of this and that, or to lessen how gruesome it is and how awful it is and things like that. But it's kind of like, okay, different circumstances do call for different things. And if you describe the specific actions in a violent confrontation, it's always going to sound bad and gruesome. And like if you describe, I'm going to try and mention something not too graphic, but if you describe someone taking a knife and slitting someone's throat and then jabbing it into their stomach, that sounds bad. And describing that, it's like, oh man, no one should do that. But then if you put it within a context of the person who did that was defending his family in his kitchen from someone breaking in and trying to murder one of them or abduct his children or something like that, and it was an act of self-defense, well, yeah, that doesn't make it less gruesome, and it doesn't make it any better in terms of the circumstance, but it does show that under those circumstances, the person was justified in doing what they did, because what other option did they have other than just allowing their children or spouse or whatever to be killed?
Mm-hmm.
And so in a circumstance like this, where Nicanor is clearly being treacherous and then, is coming against, again, this is not only coming against the individuals and saying, oh, I'm going to defeat your troops. This is coming against their whole society, their whole culture. In ancient Jerusalem, the temple was the center of the economy, the center of worship, the center of everything. It's not equivalent to burning down a church. It's not equivalent to restricting religious liberty. It is inclusive of restricting religious liberty, but it is so much more. The temple was the center of government establishment. It was the center of commerce in terms of banking system. Like in Second Temple Judaism, there was no bank other than the temple. And it's really like, man, okay, this is talking about what Nicanor was doing, was talking about destroying a people. That's how bad it was. So it's kind of like, to equate this to something is that we can understand more in our contemporary day. Nicanor is basically the equivalent of Hitler. And his actions were essentially equivalent of what Hitler was doing to the Jews. At least that's what Nicanor was threatening. And so no one would look at a group of Jews who said, all right, we can't allow this to happen. We got to stand up to this guy and fight him. And if that was to happen today, or let's just backtrack and say, okay, we're in the 1940s and a group of Jews raises up against Hitler. Let's say there's no other nations who get involved and try to help the Jews. And so a group of Jews arise and they go to battle against, the Nazis. And let's say they kill them and they kill Hitler. And in order to, as part of their self-defense, in trying not to just be attacked again by the rest of the Nazis, they dismember Hitler and put his head on a stake. I honestly don't think today many people would say that, oh, those Jews, they're just such barbarians, and, look how awful it is what they're doing. I really think that people today would have an understanding of that, in that, okay, this is an oppressed minority that was about to be wiped out, and if they didn't do something about it, they would have been wiped out. I think that people would really understand that, and that is essentially the circumstances that they were in. And some people, like in many cultures, being killed is bad, but it's not the worst thing that you could do, to just simply be killed. In some cultures, to steal from someone is equivalent to killing them, because you're taking away their means of life, and you're giving them a slow death rather than just killing them. And for that reason, sometimes it's viewed as even worse than just killing someone. Destroying someone's heritage, putting people, and the Greeks were big on slavery. Most likely what would have happened is that the Jews who weren't killed would have been taken as slaves, and this was really bad slavery. Like, we're talking about essentially genocide of the Jewish people. And, something had to be done. And as awful as it was to take someone's head and display it like that, again, the question is, what other option did they have that would actually have the effect of removing that threat upon their whole people?
And it's easier to manage part of a body than the whole body, less weight to carry and maneuver and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, as far as the decapitation and all that, there may have been very practical reasons, for not going to the trouble to display the whole body. It's not necessary. You can identify a person by their face alone. You can't always identify a person by their body without their face, but with their face and without the body you can.
So in a sense you could say it's the minimal required for the purpose of identification.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, here we're tripping out about slander. Meanwhile, back in the Maccabees, that's like excessively graphic and gruesome. And even for the purposes of, future defense, it does not excuse the graphic nature of the violence. And, there might have been not another way, but this way sucks too.
Yep. I certainly agree that this way is, there's no good way.
Awful.
Exactly, that's the point. There's no good way, and this isn't good. I mean, this is far, far from good. The question is just, under the circumstances, is, it's kind of the lesser of two evils sort of thing, you know. Yeah, it doesn't make it a good thing just because it's the lesser evil thing, that's for sure. But, yeah, it's kind of like, yeah. At the same time, it's like, I can't help but just think, okay, what would any one of us do if someone mortally attacked us and or our immediate family, let's say? And, you know, I mean, what do we have around us? Like, we're basically going to reach for whatever we have around us to try and defend ourselves, and it may end up resulting in the death of the attacker, and especially if it's something like a war where it's a bunch of people with weapons coming to us. I mean, we're going to try and find something to use to defend ourselves, and simply, like, sometimes it may even be dependent on what we have around us. What objects are in our immediate presence might determine how graphic and awful of a death the other might have to experience in order to defend ourselves and or our family. And yeah,
all I have are pots and pans.
Yeah, whatever. If you have pots and pans, if you know, you might have your poker stick for your fire or whatever.
Oh, that's true.
And it's just like, yeah, I mean, just changing what items are being used in the confrontation will determine how awful it is and how awful it is perceived to be. And in a sense, the circumstances, while they don't excuse the gruesomeness in the sense of they don't make it any less gruesome, they do justify what is done in the sense that the alternative is even worse. So one of the main things, like Teresa said a minute ago, sin is awful. Yeah, that's one of the main things that I get from this. Sin is awful.
So imagine the strange act that our Heavenly Family has to do in destroying anyone. Yeah, it definitely, I mean, there's nothing nice about death. And, you know, I genuinely had the question as to, okay, well, was it right for them to display the head and the hand? Was it right to do this or that or whatever? And I can see circumstances where it would be not wrong. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, you have to send a message somehow of, okay, he's dead. Depending on what the motivation was, would determine largely whether their hearts were in the right place, whether, you know, were they just happy about how things were done and what was done and all that. And so with our Heavenly Family, you know, they love humanity. They are doing everything they can to save humanity. And so any act of taking life from any creature on the planet really is just against their nature, but sometimes it has to be done.
In order to save the lives of
many,
many more, yeah.
Yeah, so even though I'm not going to ever read this story and think, oh, good, you know, it still has helped a lot to really be able to understand it in a way that I can see, even though it's awful, what took place, you know, what other option really was there under the circumstances. It wasn't like the Jews went to Nicanor to destroy him. and succeeded and said, look, we conquered you, and we're going to display your body parts. No, he went to destroy them, and they were able to defend themselves. And so it makes sense. Like, I don't think any nation would look at a historical account like this and say, oh, they defended themselves? Well, that was wrong.
Yeah. And seriously, I think paralleling this with the Holocaust really does help to put things in perspective.
And speaking of pictures of dead bodies, I mean, you have thousands just of pictures, thousands of people thousands of Jews, I should say, that their pictures of their dead bodies now are forever out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awful. You know, it's interesting how we haven't ended up really discussing the idea of, you know, observing the feast or not, and kind of those sorts of things, and maybe we'll get into that tomorrow and Monday night. But I'm glad that we've ended up discussing this aspect, because the fact of reality is that human history is full of violence and suffering. It's not just Jewish history or Israelite history. It's human history. And people in our past have done some awful things, sometimes for awful reasons, sometimes because that was the only thing that could be done. And it's just things that we have to come to terms with. I mean, violence in the Bible is one of the most difficult areas that, you know, believers have to discuss. And the same, though, is true for anyone. I mean, the Western world today, you know, we have what we call the classics. We look at the writings of the Greek classics, and a lot of our culture is indebted to these ancient Romans and Greeks. And a lot of these people are looked upon as being, you know, significant contributors to who we have become. And yet, those societies were by no means free of violence and much else, too. I mean, there were some awful things that were done. There is no culture, there is no society who can look back on their ancient past and say, we are free of violence and of atrocity and of all of these different things that we look back on and say, oh man, how awful. Ancient religion, quote unquote, even though that wasn't necessarily a category that they had, they didn't view things in the way that we do. Ancient religion had animal sacrifice as an integral part of it. And that was just the norm. And we think of the killing of animals today and recognize how awful it is, whether it's done at the Jerusalem temple or a temple in Egypt or a temple in Babylon or whatever or wherever it is. This was commonplace. This was the norm. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because, you know, sometimes, you know, people look at some of the things that were done by the Jews, even if it was in self-defense, and look at the graphic nature of it and say, oh, look how awful this is or how awful that was. And while, yes, I agree it's awful, I still don't think it's right for people to kind of isolate them and talk about, oh, how awful the Jews were and this and that because there was acts of violence and this and that, when there is no culture who wasn't also engaged in the same things. Again, this doesn't justify, just because everyone's doing it, it doesn't justify violence on the part of another. Again, although I am qualifying, there are times of justifiable violence when it's for the purpose of defending innocent people and so on and so forth. I mean, that's certainly the case because what else can be done? But it's so important for us to recognize that it would be wrong to look on like an act like this on the part of Judas Maccabeus and those with him, his compatriots, and to accuse them and to accuse the Jews of being barbarous people and so on and so forth, and then at the same time to say, oh, well, I'm so grateful for this or I'm so grateful for that, that stems back to another culture, and to praise that without likewise, acknowledging the violence that was done within some of their histories. And so basically what I'm trying to say is that we need to be careful not to be hypocritical and to look at the violence of one group and really emphasize it and look at how bad it was and not acknowledge the violence of another group and how it was equally bad, and also not to use the violence of one group to negate the positive things that have come from that same tradition, whether you're talking about Greeks or Romans or Jews or Egyptians or Babylonians or whoever.
Something that comes to my mind also, I can see, I've heard and witnessed people taking the approach like against God and against, the God of the Bible, the Old Testament, that sort of thing. That's different phrases that are used. And saying, oh, see how awful that God is. Who would want to worship a God like that? That God directs, innocent people to be killed or whatever. And various things that are said about it. And so I was thinking about that. And I was thinking about some of the things that could be said or claimed against the idea of killing for the purpose of self-defense or preservation of culture or whatever. And if you're opposed to ever any violence, I'm just picturing a scenario where, let's say, a person or a group of people, they just absolutely refuse to defend themselves. Okay, for example, in the Maccabees, when the Maccabean revolt first started, people fled to the caves and they refused to defend themselves on the Sabbath. And so they were easy targets. Their enemies would just come and burn them in the caves because they weren't doing anything to protect themselves. So if that continued, what would end up happening? Well, the people who have no qualms about killing or inflicting violence would just have no restraint. And they would continue to do that until everybody who refused to defend themselves, and so, i.e., the people who promote peace, well, they would just all be killed. And then the only people that would be left are people who don't promote peace and are fine with violence. So then they just start, then on each other. And eventually, yes, everyone would die.
So an odd kind of paradox of this is basically that sometimes avoiding the atrocity of violence can actually promote violence.
Right.
If we don't stand up to violence, at some point, it may take over and become the end of us all. And so, and ultimately, I mean, as awful as that is, I mean, it's not to glorify violence at all, but it is to say that sometimes there is literally nothing else that can be done against violence other than to respond with violence against violence.
Mm-hmm.
That's awful. I really wish it wasn't that way.
Yeah.
I really do wish it wasn't that way, but unfortunately, that is the severity of it. That's how it is. How awful.
And, of course, that's not to promote ever seeking violence for the sake of violence. You can't take the law into your own hands and decide, how these people, I think they're called renegades sometimes. Maybe I have the wrong term. But, you hear about people, and comic book superheroes are patterned after this sort of thing, where they just decide, okay, there's too much violence, and the police, the law, isn't taking care of it well enough, so I'm going to do it on my own. And they just go out and they do their own quote-unquote justice.
Right.
And that's wrong.
Vigilantes.
Yeah.
What's that?
Vigilantes?
Yeah, maybe so. That may be the right word, vigilante. Yeah, I'm really still not sure, but that could be. But yeah, only in self-defense could I personally, I think, or the defense of a helpless individual. That's really, when I said self-defense, though, I just mean defending the helpless, whether it's me or someone else. And I guess if I'm defending myself, I'm not helpless, but you know what I mean. But yeah, just defending the innocent, I think, is the only justifiable time for violence.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think there's any other justifiable time, really. But it's, yeah, I mean, these are things that are tough to contemplate, that are tough to really think on for even a short while. But I think it is important to do because it's something that we cannot avoid in this life. This world is not a pleasant place in every regard. In some regards, it is, but certainly not in every regard. And we need to know how to view these things right. And the easy thing to do would be to just say, oh, how awful, this stuff is so bad, and anyone who in any way has had any participation in violence is just totally wrong. That'd be the easy way to do it, but that's obviously not an accurate way to do it.
Yeah, and even the laws of the nations. I mean, most, if not all, and maybe not all, because I'm not familiar with the laws of most other nations, but of the ones I am kind of aware of, it seems like the general accepted thing that, hey, you know what? If your life or the life of someone else is being mortally threatened, then, I guess that was redundant, if the life of someone is being threatened, then you're justified in, defense even to the death if need be, like if that's your only recourse. And so, us even talking about that, we're just basically contemplating what the laws already allow for anyway.
Certainly. So our timer just went off to let us know that there's 5 minutes. I don't know if there's much more to discuss in regard to this. Again, we do have a meeting tomorrow night and the following night, and we can continue to discuss some of these things. The Purim story is also one of deliverance from genocide. So we'll see. Are you guys all good with ending the meeting tonight?
Yeah, we're good.
Good.
Okay, cool. Would someone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will.
Great.
Dear Heavenly Family, we just thank you so much for this call tonight. We thank you for the principles that we can learn through the history of the church, and we just thank you for preserving the Jewish people and preserving our church today, ultimately through the history that's occurred. And we just thank you so much for the branch message. We thank you so much for prophecy, and we just look forward to what will be revealed in the next couple of days for Purim, and we just ask that you bless all the branch members in the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
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 All right. Love you all.
Love you too.
Love the Tov.
All right, so.